Hi everyone! Since 2021 I'm experimenting with the Deep Sky Lucky Imaging technique in astrophotography, and recently I thought it might be a nice idea to share some of my knowledge and experience that I gathered over the last 2 years in this field in a short series of tutorials. These tutorials will cover my equipment, the typical imaging workflow, and also the evaluation of the recorded data set, and finally the stacking and processing of the Lucky imaging data. So let's start with part 1, a discussion of my Lucky imaging equipment and some of the challenges that are related to this equipment. So here you can see my main imaging telescope. It's a 14-inch HHD with a massive 14-inch mirror mounted on a CGE Pro mount, which is also quite massive. So it's a really nice multi-purpose telescope, so you can use it for deep sky imaging in hyperstar as well as prime focus mode, and also for planetary, lunar and solar imaging. Now you might be more familiar with the smaller brother of the C14, that's the C8 telescope, and just for fun I mounted the same scope, so my old C8 classic telescope, on the CGE Pro mount, which is a little bit over mounting the telescope. So it weighs only about 6 kilograms. So if you're familiar with this telescope, it's really easy to set up. Contrary to the C14 in the photo, it doesn't seem to be much larger than the C8, but trust me, it is really a massive telescope, not only in terms of its size, but also in terms of its mass. So the weight is quite extraordinary. So the C8 weighs about 6 kilograms, but the C14 about 20 kilograms. And that is a significant problem because the mass is distributed over a really large volume. So you somehow have to find a way on how you can handle this massive telescope. Because if you want to use it as a mobile setup, you always have to bring it outside. And not only the telescope, but also the mount, which in total weighs also around 70 kilogram, with the heaviest part of about 25 kilogram. So every clear night you have to bring the mount and the telescope outside, set it up, and later in the morning break it down again. So you have to be really motivated to set up the telescope and use it. So my advice would be, go to a star party, take a look how big it is in reality, and perhaps you can also convince some owner of the C14 that you can carry around a little bit the OTA, so that you get a feeling of the mass that you have to handle. And then you might reconsider if you really want to buy a C14 telescope. If you want to use it in observatory, that's perfectly fine. So basically it's an observatory telescope, but I use it in a more mobile setup, which is not really a good idea actually. So you have to be a little bit crazy to do that every clear night, setting up and later on breaking it down again. To get a better idea of the size of the telescope, I compared here the two dew shields of my C8 and the C14. So obviously on the right hand side you can see the dew shield of my old C8, and then you have here the dew shield of the C14, which might give you an idea how massive this telescope really is. Next, I want to discuss some of the challenges that are related when you're trying to deal with such a big telescope. So I already mentioned the heavy weight of the scope, so 20 kilograms for the OTA and 70 kilograms for the CGE Pro mount. Another issue is the height of the telescope, as you can see in this image. So you need a 3 to 4 step ladder to reach the upper part of the OTA, which is really important when you have to collimate your scope for maximum performance. This becomes an even larger issue if you also have to add a dew shield on top of the telescope. So you have to feel really comfortable to climb on a quite large ladder during the night and then keep the balance on this ladder. Yeah. So really be careful when you're doing this, which is generally a good advice because there are a lot of heavy masses involved in the setup. So chances are really high if you're moving too quickly that you bang your head either at the OTA or the counterweights. So always be careful when you're moving around this massive telescope. That's a really important security advice. I already mentioned the mass of the mount and the telescope. The biggest issue that I have is not setting up the mount, but setting up the OTA on the mount, because you have to lift this massive scope over your center of gravity, which is not really a comfortable feeling. So the first time I set up the scope, I thought maybe I should return the scope and get a C11 instead, because I thought I can't really handle that. But if you have done it a few times, it becomes a little bit more comfortable and easy to do. Yeah, so there are various techniques how you can mount the OTA on the CGE Pro mount, but it's still a little bit a hassle because you have this uncomfortable distribution of mass over a really large volume. And while there are handles on the OTA, it's still not easy to set up the telescope. So that's the first issue that you always have. And my recommendation would be set up the scope during daytime. Yeah, because at night it becomes even more a hassle if you try to do that. So the next challenge that I want to discuss is balancing the telescope. This is really important because the balancing affects also the guiding of the scope. So your aim would be to achieve a really good balancing of the scope. The problem is you not only have the OTA, but you will attach a lot of other stuff to the telescope. So the 3 10-kilogram counterweights are simply not enough. I bought another counterweight. Also to shift a little bit the center of gravity more to the center of the whole setup. Yeah, that's also a good idea to do. But I mounted a guide scope and maybe you add a hyperstar or a focal reducer and your camera and all the other stuff to the telescope. So you definitely need an additional counterweight. Now I already mentioned that mounting the OTA on the CGA Pro is quite complicated. What's even more complicated is balancing the scope in declination direction, because the gravity will always push the telescope downwards. So if you try to move the telescope upwards, you always have to work against the gravity. And that's not easy if you have a 20-kilogram telescope. So balancing a C8 in declination axis is really easy. You can do this with one hand, but balancing a C14 is a completely different story. And so the solution that I found, the easiest one, is to find an optimum balancing point and mark that on the dovetail. You see this weak marking over here, which I should really enhance to not forget where this marking really is. So this balancing point is perfect when I want to use the Hyperstar system for hyperstar imaging, but also for prime focus imaging. So either with a focal reducer or for planetary or lunar work. Unfortunately, you never get a perfect balancing because in case of the hyperstar, you have a lot of mass in front of the telescope. In case of prime focusing imaging, you have the focal reducer and a lot of mass behind the telescope. So in order to avoid to balance the scope in declination direction, I have added these additional counterweights that you can see here to the dovetail. And actually I'm using these counterweights now to balance the telescope in declination direction. Because as you can imagine, it's much easier to move these small counterweight masses than the mass of the big C14 OTA. Additionally, I added some extra mass. So for example, in case I'm using the C14 in hyperstar mode, I added here this finder scope. And the only purpose of this finder scope is to act as a counterweight. So I never use this finder scope, but it's perfect for balancing the scope if I have a lot of mass in front of the telescope. Here you can also see that I added a dovetail on top of the telescope and then this massive guide scope, which has an aperture of 70 millimeters and a focal length of 400 millimeters. The guide camera, which you cannot see here, is a ZWO ASI 120mm Mini. I typically use this guide scope for hyperstar imaging, but also for lucky imaging to introduce dithering between the images. So this is really a significant issue if you try to balance the C14 in declination direction. So I basically use my guide scope and these counterweights on the dovetail to balance the scope in declination direction. Another issue is to bring the telescope down to ambient temperature in order to avoid turbulent flow within the OTA. So in case of the C8, it's quite easy. You put the telescope out for 1 hour and then it's in thermal equilibrium. Here it's really bad. So I bought the scope in 2014 and I invested a lot of time into solving this issue. So first, when you try to use passive cooling, it doesn't really work. So you can wait the whole night and the telescope will simply never reach thermal equilibrium, at least at my location. So I'm in Central Europe and the temperatures are simply changing all the time. So it is not really easy to reach thermal equilibrium here. So simply setting up the scope and hope you can reach thermal equilibrium, it will not work. Then I tried to use cooling packs. So I bought about a dozen of cooling packs, throw them into the freezer and then put it on the scope at the beginning of the night and hope that it would cool down the OTA, but obviously this is also a passive cooling method which you cannot really control, so also a really bad idea. So all the passive cooling systems are simply not working. So instead I used these Tempest coolers, which simply replace the original venting system of the C14 Edge HD with these CPU coolers. So you simply exchange the air inside the tube with the air surrounding the tube, and with this approach you can easily reach ambient temperature after about 30 minutes. Typically, I wait until the sun sets, then start to run the cooler for about 3 hours, and then let it run over the course of the whole imaging session. So that is a really nice way to actively cool your OTA. These CPU coolers don't look really promising. They seem to be a little bit flimsy, but they actually work. So after I'm using these Tempest coolers, the C14 really began to show its maximum performance. So that is also a really critical part for lucky imaging. Bring your telescope down to ambient temperature in order to avoid tube currents or convective motion within the OTA. Another issue is that the C14 has a massive corrector plate in front of the telescope, which seem to attract dew within a few seconds if you set it outside, again, at least at my location. So you have to somehow prevent forming dew on the corrector plate, and the only solution that I found is to use a dew shield together with a dew heater. So you can see here this black dew heater stripe. And I have to turn the performance of the dew heater to maximum in order to make it work. So the manual says you have to set it to 15% or something like that. That's never enough. So for this large corrector plate, I set the dew heater to 100% performance, and then the corrector plate remains dew free if and only if you also add this dew shield. Yeah, so you have to use this combination in order to be sure that the corrector plate remains free of any dew. Another thing is I highly recommend for this large aperture a non-flexible dew shield. So there are a lot really cheap flexible dew shields, but they simply don't work. They lead to really deformed star shapes, and so you have to get a really rigid kind of dew shield, and unfortunately they cost quite a lot of money. So you have to invest there again a lot of money, but that's typical. The larger the scope is, the more you have to invest into the accessories. Speaking of expensive accessories, I also added the Celestron focus motor, which seemed to be like a luxury item. However, I highly recommend that you try to remove as many variables as possible from your imaging workflow. So it might be a good idea, oh no problem, I don't need an electronic focuser, I can always focus by hand. And that may be true, but if you have to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning after you already have done a collimation, it becomes quite cumbersome, especially in case you realize on the next day that all of your images are not in perfect focus. So while this focus motor sometimes has some technical glitches, it's still really useful to automate the focusing process. So if you set all the focus parameters, for example in Nina, correctly, then the focus motor will work perfectly fine. So therefore I would say invest some money into a good focus motor, especially for the C14, where you might have also some image shifting. So after a certain period of time, it's always a good idea to refocus the image. And you don't want to do this manually all the time. Finally, let's take a look at the back of the telescope. So this is my typical setup for prime focus lucky imaging. So on the right hand side you can see this 0.7 reducer, which by the way also costs a lot of money. But it brings down the f ratio from f11 to f7.7, which is quite important for lucky imaging, that you have a fast, in quotation marks, scope. It would be nicer to have an f4 scope, but f7.7 is better than f11. To achieve the optimum back focus distance of 146.05 millimeters, I have here this T adapter, and then a few extension rings, which are actually delivered together with the ZWO camera that you can see here at the back. So I have this 16.5 millimeter extension ring and then this 21 millimeter extension ring. And that is basically all you need. I also have a filter slider with a size of 21 millimeters. So that is also available from ZWO. So you can introduce filters in this setup. Yeah, and then at the end I have the ZWO ASI 1600 Pro. So this is my Lucky Imaging setup, which has a pixel scale of 0.29 arc seconds per pixel, which seemed to be a good compromise for imaging under fair to good seeing conditions. And so here you have it. This was a short overview of my Lucky Imaging setup. As you can see, you have to deal with a lot of challenges when updating from a C8 scope to a C14. However, if you're motivated to use such a big scope, all these problems can be solved in one way or another. And the advantages of using a C14 compared to a C8 are quite significant, not only in terms of light gathering power, but also in terms of resolution. So I hope you find this short overview of my Lucky Imaging equipment useful. I thank you for your attention and I see you in the next tutorial. Bye for now.